morning to you. It's good to see you. There is a good chance that if you and I were to compare our top 10 movie list, that there would be some similarities. Like there might be a Star Wars film on there or something like that. But I think if we go deep into a top 10 films list of all time, your opinion, my opinion, there might be some differences. And you might be surprised to see some films that I have on my list. I've been called kind of a weird person when people get to look at my favorite films. But one of the top 5 films, ones I can't wait to watch with my kids to pass it on to them, is the movie Moneyball. Moneyball is a film that's made after a book by Michael Lewis, who did some reporting about one of the most improbable recent sports stories in our recent history. It was a story about the Oakland Athletics and their pursuit of trying to put a baseball team together that would compete with other franchises with a lot more money. Because some of you might know, if you're tuning into sports, that baseball doesn't have a lot of parity in it. And it really didn't have a lot of parity in the 90s and the early 2000s. Those who had the most amount of money could buy the best players, and they ended up being the usual suspects winning the World Series. And so there's this governing question for ball clubs like Billy Beanes here, who Brad Pitt played, is that could his little small franchise, the Oakland Athletics, have any chance of competing with the giants out there? Could David beat Goliath in the game of baseball? I think that you and I have probably been in a similar situation like that. Maybe not in baseball or in sports or something like that, but there's probably an era of life, some part of our life, where the odds are really stacked against us. And no matter how hard we tried or new ideas that we created, we couldn't seem to make any forward motion on that. Perhaps it's you're a small company in a large industry and you'd love to gather a bigger piece of the pie, and so you and your team work together to try to figure that out, but it seems like again and again the big guys always win. Or maybe there's a family issue and it's a strain on relationships and you try different things, different tactics, but it doesn't seem like the thing ever gets resolved. And so maybe you feel like you're just roaming around the giants, and sometimes we get this fatalistic perspective about life that maybe there's some big cosmic force out there that's ultimately just going to squash us down the road, so we might as well give up. Now, as people of faith, we don't want to conclude there. We want to believe in the impossible, because Jesus said with human beings things are impossible, but with God all things are possible. And so we have to figure out, what can we do to imagine that we can thrive among the giants? Well, starting today, we're going to do a 6-week sermon series over the New Testament book of Colossians. And at the heart of the letter that Paul writes to this church in the city of Colosse is this question of how can we compete among the giants of our city? In fact, I just picked up a new translation that's out there from the New Testament, and it was put together by New Testament theologians who are also First Nations people. And so they're writing of the New Testament, they're translating the New Testament with First Nations perspective, and they've got this interesting title to the letter to the Colossians. The title is Small Man, which is Paul's name defined, to the sacred family, which is the church, in the village of giants, because Colosse means to be among the giants. What we see in the book of Colossians is, this is the backstory, a small group of believers who believe in the gospel of Jesus, and they're trying to make their way in their city. Now, it's important to know some of the background information about the city of Colossae so that we can have a better perspective of these words that Paul writes to this church. Colossae was a part of this trade route that led to Ephesus. Ephesus, where the book of Ephesians comes from. Ephesus was the 4th largest city in the Roman Empire, and it was the largest city in Asia Minor where these constellation of cities were. And so the trade route would go through these little towns like Colossae and Laodicea, and ultimately you want to land in Ephesus. So if you were in business, you wanted to be in Ephesus. If you were a magician, you wanted to take your act to Ephesus. If you were a snake oil salesperson, you wanted to hone your craft in such a way where you would be welcomed in the city of Ephesus. Well, you don't start there if that's where you want to end. You go to some of these smaller stages, like the city of Colossae, and you try to hone your act there so that you don't make a big fool of yourself in Ephesus if you were to go there. It'd be kind of like a magician going to Reno, Nevada before they go to Las Vegas. Okay, they got to work the thing out here, all the kinks and all the weird stuff out, perfect it so that you can have a better response when you get to the big stage. And so the city of Colossae was full of a bunch of different ideas. Week after week, night after night, somebody would come to their main stage and they would have another idea for people to consider. So Colossae's culture was like a circus. New ideas, all these things swirling around all the time. Perhaps a confusing place, but an exciting place nonetheless. I remember when I was studying Colossians for the first time in college, and my Bible teacher, Irma Pruto, she said, imagine like a big bowl of fruit salad. Imagine it with me. You got bananas and strawberries and blueberries and everything in there, and it kind of sits outside in the outdoor picnic, and things begin to melt, and people begin to make their way through that big bowl of fruit, and it gets to the bottom. You ever see the bottom, like the dregs of a fruit salad bowl? And you think to yourself, this could be like a mixed fruit punch. Maybe I should finish this, right? And it seems like a great idea. And so you grab the rim of it and you begin to tip it towards your mouth. And you're like, you know what? This is not a good idea. Because who knows what type of flies have been flying in there? And who knows if that's going to be appetizing or not? Irma Pruto, she said that was the city of Colossae. A bunch of ideas swirling around. And it seemed appetizing. It is actually quite dangerous. Now, on the one hand, this is an opportunity for the early church because the city was open to brand new ideas. They wouldn't get stiff-armed by everybody out of cynicism. People would be eager to hear their story. But the threat is that Christianity was going to get lumped into all these other options, these snake oil presentations, this new philosophy that's spinning out there. And so there was a threat to be misunderstood because they would just be lumped into all these other things. In fact, the great rival of the early church in the first few centuries was Gnosticism, and many scholars believe that the initial argument against Gnosticism can be located here in some of the words from the Apostle Paul in the book of Colossians. And so the governing question for the church in Colossae must have been this, and they were probably seeking Paul's advice as he's writing from prison. They're asking themselves, can our faith compete and thrive on a crowded street with all these different ideas swirling around? We're not the only shop on the street. And so how can we gain a voice? How can we gain some ground in a culture like ours? I believe as a Christian that the Bible is a living word, and so even though this letter was written centuries ago to a city not ours, to a church not ours, I believe that God can do something in a mystery. He can take these words that Paul intended for another group of people, and he can make them useful in our lives. And I don't think that we have to try too hard on this one, because I think that you and I could agree in the same way that we are on a crowded street in regards to faith in modern America. Religious life has changed. The landscape has changed over the last several decades. People assume that because the majority of Christians went to church, that perhaps the majority of Americans would always go to church. But slowly over time, as we comb through all the correspondences and all the literature from American history, particularly religious history, something began to emerge at the end of the 19th century going into the 20th century. There began to be some skepticism about the staying power of religion. Now, leaders and those who were forecasting the future, they were saying, I think people will always have a private faith in America, and many of them will pick the Christian faith as their private faith. It just won't be as prevalent in the public square. Because sometimes, have you noticed, sometimes as religious people, we can be a tad extra. Try to change the color of the carpet in a church, and we kind of get a window into sometimes our allergy towards being a tad particular. And so when that boils out into the public square, many people began to imagine, if we could turn down the volume on religion, perhaps we can have a more civil and cool-headed conversation in regards to how to organize ourselves in public. And this began to happen in Europe, and so they felt like this is going to be the drift, and it's going to drift over into the United States. And so here, maybe by the mid-20th century, religion will go out of style. What they found, though, is that religion has stayed, and it's continuing to thrive. But the big surprise is that Christianity is not the only option on the crowded street today. And it's not just different brands of Baptist, like the Independent Baptist, the Free Will Baptist, the Calvinist, Reformed Baptist. No, it's way, way different ideas about religion or irreligion than we could have ever have imagined. So as the church in Colosse was asking, can our faith thrive on a crowded street like ours? I believe that those who have a vested interest in Christianity, we're asking the same question. Does Christianity have the opportunity to thrive on crowded streets like we have in modern America? And so it's into this discussion that the Apostle Paul begins to give us a framework about how we can thrive in our faith in this world, even though we exist on a crowded streets. And so we're going to talk about several different ideas along this theme over the next 6 weeks. I hope that informs you and I in our modern day application of Christianity today. So let's start at the very beginning. Paul greets the church, and then in the first 3 to 8 verses of the first chapter, Paul begins to admire the church. And there's several important things that he admires. He admires their faith towards God. He says that you have love towards all of God's people, that you're embracing a true message of the gospel. And this gospel is not just head knowledge in your life, but it's changing who you are, and that reputation is beginning to billow out to other areas of the world. I mean, he's a considerable distance at this point than the city of Colosse, and he's hearing through the grapevine, before TikTok and all that stuff, he's hearing of the reputation of the Colossian church. So he starts out the letter by saying, you guys have a lot going for you, and it's impressive. He says, but I think there's more in store for you. So he begins to have a wish prayer for them in that verses 9 and following. He asks that God would fill them with his knowledge of his will, that they would be wise in keeping with the Spirit and asking for the Spirit's help. But it culminates in this idea in verse 10 of chapter 1. He says, so that you may live a life worthy of the Lord and please him in every way, bearing fruit in every good work, growing in the knowledge of God. So Paul says, listen, God has given you a great gift. You've had a great start to your faith. And yes, it is challenging on your crowded street, but your reputation precedes you. Everyone's talking about what God's doing in your city and in your church. But there's more. And this more, he says, I want you to then now, because of all that reputation, all that God's already done, I want you to live a life worthy of it, that continues to prove of all the things that God has given you. I started thinking about worthiness and the idea of worthy this week, and worthy seems to have a relativity to it. It's when we compare two things, and we begin to talk about, is this thing worthy of this thing? So for instance, some of you high school students, you're applying to college, and in order to afford college, unless you're an organized crime, you're going to have to get a scholarship, right? But there's not a lot of scholarship dollars out there, and so you're going to apply for scholarship that other students are going to apply for, and so you're going to fill out an application, you're going to probably write a story that they're going to proofread, and they're going to look at all your extracurriculars and all that stuff, your ACT scores, and there's going to be a committee of people who've probably never met you, and they're going to say, is this student worthy of this scholarship package? Do they rise to the worthiness to receive this? Now, if they say no, they say, well, maybe they are worthy of this scholarship package. So there's a relativity there. I started thinking about, so I've got a middle school daughter, Avery, and around the bend at some point, she's going to have young dudes come ask her to go out on a date, and they're going to come by the house, and they're going to ask my permission, or at least they better. And I'm going to look them over, and I'm going to see if they're worthy of dating my daughter. And I've been coached that no young man is worthy of dating your daughter. So the answer is always going to be no. But they may be worthy of dating somebody else's daughter, just not mine. Okay, so there's a relativity there, right? In relationship, there's a relativity. Some of us are sports fans, and so there's coaching changes on sports teams all the time. And so there's this hunt for the next coach of our favorite team. And when there are some rumors of some names, we begin to say, is this coach worthy of the responsibility of leading our team into the future? So when Paul says, live a life worthy of the gospel, he's got the particular condition in mind. their city, their experience, their opportunities, live a life worthy of that, in connection to that. I think it's important for us to keep in mind because worthiness has some relativity. Oftentimes it is associated with the context that you're connected to. It's the same thing as we talk about how to live a life worthy on crowded streets as the church here in America. Because this crowded street has not been the crowded street that we've had in America. I mean, when Christianity started in America, it was during colonialism, during farmsteads, and so there was like one church, and there was like farms surrounding these churches, and you didn't go to that church, evaluate the sermon, wonder if somebody greeted you adequately on that Sunday morning, and say, well, since it didn't pass my test, I'm going to go to the next church 30 miles away. I mean, that's not what you did in the first couple hundred years of American church life. You went to church, you brought casserole with you for the church potlucks, okay? You raised your kids to go to that same church. You led in the church whenever you had the opportunity to do so. If you had a fight with somebody in that church, you wouldn't say, well, then I'm going to go somewhere else. You would work it out. Imagine the thought. You would work it out, and you would continue to worship there. And then when you died, you would have a funeral service in that church, and then they would bury you right next to the church. Worthiness was showing up and helping the one church that was within your reach. But something happened when industrial era began to happen in American cities. People began to move to cities, and all of a sudden there were multiple churches that you can access and get to. And so people who were at the workplace going, we need to scale up our business to grow our business to be a national brand, they were also leading in churches there saying, I wonder if we could scale our ministries so that we could reach more people and compete against the Presbyterians down the road. I mean, this was during the era where you could have not just a first Presbyterian church, but also a second Presbyterian church, or a fourth, or a 17th, whatever, because churches were popping up everywhere and they were competing against one another. This was the era of the tall steeple. So what worthiness looked like was, how can I enlarge in the platform of the skilled ministers who were leading in my church so that we could compete against other worshiping communities out there? It very much mirrored what was happening in the business sector of society. So we continued on like that into the middle of the 20th century, and American population continued to grow, and suburbans began to spread, and all of a sudden more and more people started going to school, and they started going to colleges, and all of a sudden along the way, people from different religious environments began to move closer and closer into cities, and by the middle of the 20th century, we've got several small startups of different religions beginning to encroach upon our territory. And so during the information age of the church, churches began to say, you know what worthiness looks like? We need to equip our people to be able to answer questions and to prove and to defend that Christianity is the best option out of all the increasing options that we have in our culture today. This is when, I don't know if you've ever been to a church like this, where they built a sanctuary, and then several years later, they built an education wing, and they didn't really look like one another. It's like the long room with the stained glass, and then like this, I don't know, classroom space area. I mean, you look at our sanctuary, this auditorium right now, it doesn't look like the long, straight sanctuary of churches that were built in the eras before us with the stained glass behind the baptismal. It looks like a lecture hall at Kansas State University. And the pastor who gets the most people in their pews is the one who could teach the clearest, the most precise, and the deepest truth out there. Because worthiness was, can we be equipped to defend our faith against these faiths that are beginning to grow and encroach upon our territory? For an array of reasons, the education effort of the church has not kept these other options down. Other religious options have grown up around us and they've been strengthened. Now, the education era of the church was important, and many of us are blessed by it, and we should always continue to grow in the knowledge of God, as the Apostle Paul says here, but we are in different days. And this is not just a discussion for those of us who work in churches, but I think this is something that's touching all of us because all of us have coworkers and family members who have a less and less of an idea of what Christianity is. And oftentimes, we are misunderstood because we declare that we are a Christian. More times than I want to imagine. Recently, when somebody asked me what I'm doing with my life, I say that I'm a pastor, and if they're bold enough, they say, well, I just don't believe in God. And I say, well, tell me about the God that you don't believe in, because there's a good chance that I won't believe in that God as well. This is touching all of us. All of us are asking the question, how can I, with confidence and with kindness, imagine that we can thrive on the crowded streets of America religious life? This brings me back to the movie Moneyball, because as the GM Billy Beane was trying to put his team together in 2002, he was running out of options. All of his best players were sold to baseball clubs that could afford a larger salary. And there he was just kind of stuck with some mediocre guys, and they were trying to figure out how they could compete against the giants like the New York Yankees and so on and so forth. It was at that point he had an interaction with a young, aspiring baseball executive and scout named Peter Brand. This is what Peter said to him in a crucial conversation early in their relationship. He said, people who run ball clubs think in terms of buying players. Your goal should not be to buy players. Your goal should be to buy wins. And in order to buy wins, you need to buy runs. So Brand said, instead of just going out there and trying to pay for these huge salaried players who we just assume that if we get more and more of them on our team, that's going to amount to more wins. He's like, what if we break down some different statistics? What if we say, listen, how can we manufacture runs and not just have the big-time ball player on our team? Because it's ultimately more runs equals more wins, and it gets you into the playoffs, and you compete for a World Series. I mean, even today, the best player in baseball is Shohei Ohtani. He hits well and he pitches. We haven't had a player like that since Babe Ruth. He's got more home runs than anyone else in baseball right now. He plays for the Los Angeles Angels. And even though ESPN spends copious amounts of SportsCenter marveling at Shohei Ohtani, I checked this morning, the Angels at the end of the year here are still 18 games out of first place. The algebra is all wrong. And Peter Brand was onto something. He says, we got to look at how guys who get on base and who steal bases, guys who throw pitches better, not just the ones who require the largest contracts. So Peter Brand, this is what he said. I thought this was an important quotation. I think we can apply it to other parts of life. He says, people are overlooked for a variety of reasons and perceived flaws, age, appearance, and personality. But he believed that he could put together 25 players on this 2002 athletics team that were flying under the radar, that everyone had overlooked because of all these issues, that if we put them together, they can get enough runs and wins to get into the playoffs. He says when you put a team of players like this together, ones who've been overlooked, they resemble an island of misfit toys. And to be honest, when they trotted their players out throughout that year in 2002, people were raising their eyebrows. They'd never even heard of these guys. But by the end of the season, they did the unthinkable. They pieced together 20 straight wins with these players that everyone overlooked. And they made it into the playoffs, and they were able to compete against the giants of baseball. And it's because they hacked the algebra of the equation of how you have a successful baseball team. So let's apply that to who we are as Christians today in a different era. If we think more of the same from the past is going to create different results for the future, that's an interesting wager. Or if we can imagine with some creativity that we can change the algebra of what it means to be a Christian and how to be a church on a crowded street, we just might have the chance to crack the code and to make some advances on a crowded street like ours. This was the advice that the Apostle Paul gave to the church in Colosse. You got to think about your opportunity in a different way. As he goes further into this initial passage, he says in verses 11 and 12, being strengthened with all power according to his glorious might, so that you might have great endurance and patience, giving thanks to the Father. These three things in this early part of his letter to the Colossian church, he says, this is how you thrive on a crowded street. You have great patience and endurance, and you live joy-filled lives. Let's talk about patience and endurance. We live in a culture of immediacy, and the church is tempted to believe in immediacy. We believe that if we could do some drastic things, pray some big, bold prayers, God's going to intervene in a moment and everything's going to go back the way it was. But the truth is, as we study our movement and if we look at how people have been faithful in the Christian church over the years, transformation happens slowly on crowded streets. It's life after life, transformation after transformation, family after family, peer to peer, neighbor to neighbor. And over time, as Jesus taught us, leaven begins to work in a batch of dough. And over time, over a generation or two perhaps, we can look back after some really hard work and some creative thinking. We can look back and say, God has been faithful. It didn't happen overnight, but God has been faithful. So the first temptation that we have to avoid if we're going to thrive on a crowded street is to be hasty and to lose our cool if things don't happen exactly the way we want to in the timeline that we have, and we set those parameters on God. But the last thing I think is equally important. Paul says, if you want to have a voice that's unique in your culture, chaotic culture like Colosse, you be people of gratitude. And I can't think of a better prescription for us in our culture today that is marked by grievance instead of gratitude. Sociologists have said that the quickest way to unify a group of people is to articulate a common enemy, and that might be able to whip up the troops for battle. But I don't suppose it's the recipe, that it is the appropriate thing if we want to see godliness and faithfulness and love to abound in our city streets. Let's just put these ideas to the test. Would grievance or gratitude raise the dead? Grievance might get somebody a book deal. Grievance might get someone to have cameras pointed at them. But to actually have long-lasting, deep transformation in the world around us, we cannot be people of grievance, losing our minds and saying hot takes all the time. The way forward is to be people who are joy-filled and grateful, which is more infectious than we can ever have imagined. The reason that Paul says is because in the next verses, in verses 13 and 14, he says, because after all, we are people who have received great grace from our God. He has rescued us. He's redeemed us because of what he did on the cross. And so our response in the Christian life isn't grievance or losing our minds or being cranky, but it's to be grateful, to pardon others as we've so richly been pardoned, and to be marked by joy and gratitude because of the great gift of salvation that God has given us. You know, when we talk about worthiness, the thing that at times we think about is performance. I will be considered worthy if I can perform to a certain standard. And I think that's the case in other settings, but in the Christian faith, it's not quite that way. Pastor Stephen Furtick, he tried to explain it this way. He talked about the TV show The Voice. If you're familiar with The Voice, there are 4 singing coaches that face away from a stage, and a singing participant comes on stage and they try to sing a song, and they're hoping that at least one of those coaches are going to do the swivel chair and turn around and vote to take them on and to coach them. The only thing is that none of the coaches are required to turn around. And so that person is singing for their life, and there's an anxiety within them because if none of those coaches turn around, then their time on the show ends. But it gets awful fun when not just one, but several coaches turn around, and then now they have to fight over who's going to take this contestant. And the contestant actually gets to pick out of all the ones who turned around which one they're going to choose. So there's anxiety. There's worry in the singer until somebody turns around. And then there's joy because someone has considered them worthy. As Stephen Furtick was thinking about The Voice, he said, Jesus is not this way. When we go to the stage, before we even sing one bar of the song, Jesus' chair is already turned around. Therefore, there is no fear, there is no condemnation, there is no shame. But we're embraced by a radical love that no other story can boast. That's why Paul says, be grateful. Because before you and I ever had the idea to chase down and pursue God, God chased down and He pursued us. He ransomed us. He died for us. He embraced us, and He included us into His family. Therefore, our response, the only appropriate response, is gratitude. I can't think of a better way to go to the communion table